Okay, hi there everyone. My name's Dr. Matt Wilde and I'm a lecturer in human geography here at the University of Leicester. And what I'm going to give you today is a brief sample of the kinds of teaching that you would get at the University of Leicester, and specifically here in the School of Geography, Geology and the Environment. And I'm going to give you a little taster of what it's like to be taught by a human geographer, so that you can sample the way that we bring our own empirical research into the classroom. I'm going to talk about the country where I've worked for over a decade now, which is Venezuela in Latin America. I'm going to talk about Venezuela's migrant crisis. In the present moment, Venezuela is in the midst of an ongoing humanitarian crisis, and this has led to kind of mass displacement from the country. I'm going to talk about how we can understand this crisis using a human geographical perspective, and specifically by understanding the relationship between the Earth and human societies. So I will crack on. So just a little introduction to me. I received my PhD from the London School of Economics in 2013, and I've been working in Venezuela since 2008. That's where I did my doctoral fieldwork, and then I've carried on since then. I'm interested in the relationship between global forces and conditions of everyday life. So how big macro political and economic issues shape the lives that we all lead, often in ways that we don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis. And I'm also interested in how political ideas, so the way that people think about politics, the way that people think about how they would like the world to be, I'm interested in how these emerge in different material conditions. So how does your everyday life shape the way you think about politics and how you feel about the world in broad terms? And the way I kind of look into these questions is what we call ethnography. This is long-term participant observation in a given social setting. So basically, when I'm interested in an issue, I go and hang out there for a long period of time. And that's what I did and do in Venezuela. I spent 2 years living there for my PhD, and then I've been back several times since then, and I'm currently running a project looking at Venezuelan migration in neighbouring Colombia. So what I'm going to do in this taster is just do a brief overview of the present situation in Venezuela. I'm going to talk about how this relates to oil, because Venezuela is one of the largest producers of oil, and then I'm going to relate this in a wider sense to questions about migration and global inequality. So, a brief overview of Venezuelan migration. The most recent data on this suggests that in the last 4 years, over 5 million people have left Venezuela. This is a country that has a population of about 30 million, so this is a big chunk of the population have left the country in a very short period of time. Most of those now reside in other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. If you look at the image down there on the bottom right, you can see the different countries that people have gone to. And the largest recipients of displaced Venezuelans are countries like Colombia and Peru, the closest places to get to. You can see the two images there. The one on the bottom left is my good friend Guillermo, who was kind of my best friend in the community I lived in Valencia, which is a city in Venezuela. He's one of those who've left, and he's done what the people in the middle picture have done. They crossed the bridge over into Colombia, and they've tried to make a life for themselves in the best way that they can. But of course, this is often very difficult. So why have all these people left Venezuela? What's been happening in that country to cause so many people to decide to leave, and often to go to conditions that aren't particularly secure and aren't particularly safe? Well, in some ways it all relates to oil. Since the 1920s, Venezuela's entire society, so that's its economy, its politics and its culture, has been shaped by petroleum. That's because when they discovered oil in the 1920s, the government at the time decided to base Venezuela's entire development strategy around exporting oil and using the money to try and develop the country, which sounds quite logical, right? Now, on the one hand, this has created a kind of national belief in oil. There's a belief that oil will bring prosperity to Venezuela, and that it will bring prosperity for all Venezuelans. You see in the image on the right there, that's a newspaper cutting that says the black gold comes direct from the subsoil for the people. And what this means is that The most recent governments in Venezuela have tried to use oil money to develop various social initiatives, to build a welfare state, to improve health and education. And this was what I was really looking into when I went to Venezuela for the first time in 2008. But on the other hand, this drive to use oil money to develop and to build a kind of more inclusive and equal society creates contradictions. Dependence on a single export like oil means that the country is very vulnerable to the rise and fall of world oil prices. And this is particularly so for a country like Venezuela, because Venezuela is a former colony. It was a Spanish colony, which means that historically a lot of its wealth has left the country. It's been kind of extracted, often through violent and exploitative means. And that even though Venezuela has been independent since the mid-19th century, in many ways those colonial structures still shape the way that the economy works, even after it became democratic and it's had various reformist governments through the last 50 years or so. So the problem for a country like Venezuela is, how do you organise that oil wealth in a way that actually reaches the people that need it? And this has been a kind of consistent problem in the country. And this relates to the question of whether oil wealth is a blessing or a curse. In some places, oil has enabled nations to become extremely rich. And if you think about places like Norway or Saudi Arabia, what they've managed to do is use these sovereign wealth funds. So they've taken the oil money that they receive for exporting oil, they've put it into these kind of investment vehicles, and then they've invested in other areas of the economy, often abroad. And then they've used that money that comes back in from the investments to then develop the country as a whole. And you can look on the image in the top right there shows how much money is in, for example, in Norway's sovereign wealth fund. It's a huge source of income for that country. But the problem, particularly for states in the global south, is that it's much harder to do this, precisely because of the reason I gave on the previous slide, because of these kind of long-lasting and quite entrenched unequal political and economic structures. Now, this is often termed the resource curse, the fact that actually having resources alone doesn't necessarily mean that countries become wealthy or that their populations benefit from that wealth. And that's because the social and political institutions, so the way that your government works, the way that your society is structured, the way that your economy works, the way these form around oil wealth dramatically shapes the impact it can have on a given society. So in former colonies like Venezuela, the social political structures weren't necessarily designed to distribute wealth fairly or to plan for the future. And that means that those sorts of countries have often struggled to manage that oil wealth that gets generated. And they go through cycles of boom and bust. So when oil prices are high, governments have quite a lot of income and they can spend. But when oil prices drop, suddenly the whole economy starts to enter recession and they struggle to do the same. And it's very hard for them to develop a more sustainable and more stable model. And this is kind of what I saw and have seen in Venezuela over the last 10, 15, 20 years. The period I first did research in the kind of mid to late 2000s, social expenditure in Venezuela increased fivefold per inhabitant. And that's because they had this oil money and the government had been elected on a platform of increasing social spending and reducing inequality. And you can see in the graph there that oil prices rose steadily for much of the 2000s before dropping very dramatically in 2014. And for a period, this really did work. It made a big impact, and the number of Venezuelan households in poverty and extreme poverty dropped rapidly. And one of the things that I saw in the community I worked in were all sorts of social initiatives that were funded using oil money. So we have a local health centre, funding for social events, subsidised food for people on low incomes. And in my community, a new local bus service that was run by local people. And they borrowed money from the state and then invested in buses and then were kind of collectively controlling the profits from that bus company. But then what happened? Well, in 2014, world oil prices dropped dramatically. And Venezuela, because it had its entire economy based around oil exports, fell into recession. The government tried to spend its way out of the problem, but this led to a crisis of hyperinflation. It's very hard for countries who have debts to foreign countries in dollars to spend their way out of crises because their own currencies are much weaker, which means the proportion of what they have to pay out in debt is a more significant chunk of the country's overall wealth. This is why so many people have called for debt cancellation. This led to shortages in food and medicine and led also to widespread political discontent. So the huge protests against the government in 2014 and then again in 2017. And I was doing research in the middle of that in 2017, and it was pretty tough to be there. And then you have mass outward migration, which brings us back to where we started. Now, I want to just sort of zoom out a little bit and think in broader terms and beyond Venezuela. When you hear about countries like Venezuela and others in the global south, you'll often hear that their problems are a question of bad governance or of corruption. And it's certainly true that the present state in Venezuela, the present government, has many issues with what we would call bad governance and corruption, as well as kind of the erosion of democracy and human rights. And while these factors are all significant, very often they're actually symptoms rather than causes. My colleague Jason Hickel, who's based at Goldsmiths College in London, has written a book called The Divide, which is a kind of really good intro to understanding global inequality. And he argues that the global economy is basically rigged in favour of wealthy nations in the global north and multinational corporations. And he argues that countries in the global south can't really compete economically because of debt repayments, because of the way the global economy is structured, because of very unequal and uneven trade agreements between countries in the south and the north. And of course, the history here is of countries in the north being colonial powers and countries in the south being colonies. So that kind of old colonial relationship still continues, but in kind of new ways. And because of this inequality, countries in the global south are more reliant on what are often very volatile exports, like oil. So Jason argues, and I would agree with him, that we need to cancel debts from the global south to the global north. And we also need to democratize global economic institutions. So institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the institutions that govern the global economy, they're not really democratic, and they're not really sufficiently accountable, and they're not sufficiently representative of the world's population. So Jason's argument is that we need to change all of these things in order to prevent the kinds of crises that we're currently seeing in Venezuela. So to wrap up, and as you can see from the image here on the right, these are very real world problems for ordinary people who've, in the case of people I know in Venezuela, they've literally walked over the mountains with their families and their children pulling suitcases. This is a real problem. But this all links back to the problems of export-led economies in an unequal world. In times of boom, these countries can invest heavily and significantly improve people's lives in many ways. But they're extremely vulnerable to rapid downturns in their economies and in their development models. And when those downturns occur, ordinary people must suddenly make changes to their lives, such as migrating to another country. And they live their lives in these very volatile, shifting political and economic landscapes. And that can make life very, very frightening for people. So the question for us then, here in the global north, is how can we contribute to making the world fairer? How can we make the world safer? We can think about this in many different ways. COVID-19 and the kind of inequality in access to vaccines is another very good example. And it's not just a question for us as individuals, but it's also about how we relate to our political leaders and what kinds of demands we can place on them to make the world a fairer and more equal place. So this is a responsibility we all share. And this has been my introduction to human geography at Leicester. Thank you very much for listening. Here are some references for anyone who would like to look into this in more detail. And you can also email me if you'd like to go into this and have a further discussion. Thanks a lot.